So welcome on this beautiful snowy day, beautiful snowy, windy, cold, blustery day. My name is Joe White. I direct the Center for Policy Studies here at Case Western Reserve University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this Global Currents discussion, which is made possible by the generosity of Ms. Eloise Briskin. We try to do one or two of these a year to introduce people on campus to interesting arguments and scholarship about international affairs. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome Julia C. Strauss, who is Professor of Chinese Politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. And she's going to talk about some of her work, in particular on state formation in China and Taiwan. I want to emphasize that this is really unusual new work where it's very hard to do the research, because doing archival research in both China and Taiwan can take a while.
They take long.
Yeah, long time. Professor Strauss joined the faculty of SOAS in 1994. She's professor of Chinese politics, and from 2002 to 2011, she also served as editor of the China Quarterly, which is the premier research and academic journal on affairs in China. She earned a Ph.D. in political science from a wonderful institution, the University of California at Berkeley, and has published widely on 20th century state building and institutional development in both China and Taiwan, and that includes the new book, as well as her previous Strong Institutions in Weak Politics, state building in Republican China. So before the revolution, before the Communist Revolution, or during the Communist Revolution, since it's 1927 to 1940. She also has done a lot of work on the performance of politics, including co-editing with Donal Cruz O'Brien, Staging Politics, Power and Performance in Asia and Africa. And as the editor of the China Quarterly, she put together special issues on a wide range of topics, including China's roles in Latin America and in Africa, which is the background for the talk she will give tomorrow at the Friday lunch at 12:30 in the Calvin Smith Library Dampier Room. So it is my great pleasure to welcome my good friend and a great scholar, Julie Strauss, to campus.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. All right. So I'm going to make sure that the clicky thingy works. Yes, it does. All right. So state formation. Am I on? All right. In China and Taiwan, bureaucratic, campaign, and performative modalities of policy implementation in the early 1950s is the subject of my talk, and with slight variations and changes over the years, more or less the title of the book that has just been finished and is just out with Cambridge University Press. And so when we ask this question about building the Chinese state, PRC and ROC Taiwan variants in the early 1950s, we're presented, we sort of got to ask why this comparison? Why spend 15 years working on such a project? And part of the answer is that state building and institution building is kind of my thing. And this is, in a roundabout way, the topic of my first book on the Republican period in the 1930s. And so when materials began to become available on this period in both the People's Republic of China and then later, and to a lesser extent, in Taiwan, it was tremendously exciting to begin to follow through some of these questions. But from a broader comparative politics perspective, if we think about this particular comparison at this particular time, the Chinese Civil War, 45 to 49, produced a very, very unexpected historical contingency, something that nobody imagined would happen, namely the existence of two Chinese states vastly unequal in scale. The People's Republic of China, PRC, and the Republic of China, now shrunken and reduced to a relatively small island across from Fujian province on the island of Taiwan. Now, in 1949, you wouldn't have bet the ranch on either one of these regimes. becoming successful, well-consolidated, managing to push through the kinds of programs that they wanted to push through, and so forth and so on. The reasons for this were a little bit different, but just take it on faith for the moment that this was a sort of dodgy proposition in both of these places in 1949. And yet by the mid-1950s, within about 4 to 5 years, both of these regimes were very well consolidated and unusually successful exemplars of different approaches to state building, namely the revolutionary approach, PRC, and conservative authoritarian. And I put conservative authoritarian in quotation marks because they said that they were conservative, but they really weren't that conservative in a bunch of ways. And they were definitely authoritarian. So we know that this became so. We know where these things started. We know more or less where things ended, but there's almost nothing in the literature really about how this became so, namely the mechanisms and the strategies that underlay each of these regime strategies to state building, and the ways in which there was movement over time from what I call a surprising degree of convergence in terms of shared similarities that people don't really talk about that much between these two regimes, to increasingly distinctive differences that were rapidly accelerating in opposite directions, clearly by the mid-1950s. So we know that this happened, and we know that it was so. You have something here, then you have something there, and there's change over time, but there's surprisingly little on how it became so. So you gotta ask, all right, as a comparativist, political scientist, why a comparative focus on state building in the PRC, and I concentrate on the relatively wealthy area of the People's Republic of China, Sunan, southern Jiangsu, basically the area south of the Yangtze River, centered around the very, very wealthy city of Shanghai in this period. I'll get to the whys and wherefores of this choice of this particular region in a moment. But for now, give me this. In the realm of post-World War II new states, there aren't all that many opportunities to engage in deep comparisons between states that hold culture and structure more or less constant. There were a few. South and North Korea, if you could get access to North Korea, would be a very good example of this. North and South Vietnam are also candidates for this. And we have such information about South Vietnam in English in American archives that I would think that with the relative opening of Vietnam now, that there might be scope to engage in this kind of comparison in the future. And North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam would have one major, if you could get access, would have one real advantage that my PRC and Taiwan comparison does not have, namely that the units in question are more or less the same, similar in scale in terms of size. Now we do have, with my comparison, a methodological problem of incommensurate size, which goes something like this. PRC, large and big. Island of Taiwan, tiny and small. But the way in which I address this is by focusing on Sunan, the wealthy and developed region around Shanghai, as the comparator for Taiwan, for the following reasons. Both were relatively developed relative to the rest of China. Both had some degree of industry. Both had an unusually high degree of investment in things like infrastructure, railroads, big plants, and so forth. And there, in both places, had already been, in 1949, very substantial movement out of subsistence agriculture. So, what we have in 1949, it's really quite surprising given what we know from the literatures on the PRC and Taiwan. despite the enormous mutual hostility that each of these regimes had for each other, they hated each other's guts, they'd been in civil wars with each other for the previous 25 years, there was a lot of mutual infiltration, bloodshed, betrayal, so forth and so on. There were, at the same time, very substantial overlaps in structure of the state, in assumptions about state builders and about state building agendas in 1949. So I have a little chart here, which I won't go into too much detail on because I don't want to bore you too much. But the ways in which the People's Republic of China in Sunan and the Republic of China on Taiwan were very similar to each other in these dimensions in 1949, and the degree to which these kinds of elements were common in developing states more generally at mid-century. So, regional insecurity and heavy militarization, check. Common in developing states more generally, sometimes, but I think yes. Outsider is aspiration to reassert central control over territory, yes, yes. Monocratic party state, yes, both have had. Variable in the rest of the developing world. High modernist commitments to science and development, yes, very much so. In the case of Taiwan, ROC Taiwan and PRC and Sunan, variable elsewhere. The presumption of the amenability of citizens to state instruction and persuasion rather than simple coercion, yes, no. State to play, the role of the state, one of its many roles, was to ensure subsistence and a modicum of social justice. Yes, other developing states, not so much. Deep suspicion of any and all kind of associational activity, not at least indirectly overseen by the state. Yes, not so much. And the desire to impose order, vision, and communicate norms rapidly to a subject population, yes, and I would say variable. So there are all of these ways in which the assumptions and the agendas and what people thought the function of the state was really overlapped in both the people with the Chinese communists in Sunan, Beijing, and then Sunan, and also in Taiwan under the Chiang Kai-shek regime. But states aren't just static. They are actually in movement much of the time. They implement policies that in turn are part of state building. They attempt to implement preferences and choices. They do so in ways that are distinctive and that are performed in ways that may, at best, transmit regime norms, persuade populations, and attempt to build regime legitimacy. And in the case of the People's Republic of China in Sunan and the ROC in Taiwan, they did so through what I call a shifting mix of different modalities of state building and institution building, with two modalities that I call the bureaucratic here and the campaign here. And bureaucratic modalities of state and institution building and campaign modalities result in quite different registers. So the campaign is about public emotional mobilization, and the bureaucratic is procedural rectitude, order, and austerity. So let's turn a little bit to ideas that I'm still in the process of developing about bureaucratic and campaign modalities of policy implementation. The bureaucratic is hierarchical, campaign, varying and shifting mixtures of hierarchy and egalitarian participation. The bureaucratic modality is basically Weberian, regular, ongoing rulemaking based on precedent. The campaign, by definition, is extraordinary, not regular. Extraordinary short-term mobilization of resources. Sometimes the resources are material, sometimes the resources are human, to accomplish a set goal or set of overlapping goals. The bureaucratic modality is depersonalized and delimited. The campaign modality involves the mobilization of normative and emotional commitments that often, indeed typically, bleed into other ongoing campaigns. And here's what I think might be the key of all of this. Both bureaucratic and campaign modalities vastly simplify complex realities, but they simplify in very, very different ways. The bureaucratic simplifies complex realities through disaggregation of wholes into standardized categories, whereas the campaign modality simplifies through fusion, through compression, and through morally based simplified narratives. Okay, so we're in 1949. We've got major regime insecurity, and because of major regime insecurity, but also the beginnings of the tensions leading up to the Korean War. This entire period of regime consolidation is framed by regional insecurity and the Korean War. And both regimes are deeply, deeply aware that domestic security and getting rid of the other domestically is one of the most important preconditions for regime consolidation. The nationalists in Taiwan are no less aware of this than the communists in the People's Republic. Because after all, one of the reasons why the nationalists failed, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why they failed was that they never managed, when they were the recognized government of China between 27 and 49, was that they never managed to get rid of their open rivals, the communists, in China. And it is absolutely the case that there were some spies, some subversives, some sympathizers working to undermine each of these regimes from within. Now, how important these kind of subversion really was, it's a little bit hard to say, but it's almost certainly the case that neither regime was under mortal threat from within. Nevertheless, both of these regimes deliberately and explicitly resorted to campaigns of terror against presumptive domestic enemies in order to consolidate the state. So why do I say this? Well, I'm going to give you a bunch of information on this now. The main ways in which this was done was through an open campaign. So on this side, we've got the People's Republic of China. On the left, we have the People's Republic of China. And on the right, we have the Republic of China, Taiwan. So in Sunan, there was a campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, 1950 to 51, peaking and at its nastiest in May, June, July of 1951. After it calmed down, there was another Sufan cleaning out of counter-revolutionaries campaign in 1955, and this was widened further with later campaigns against rightists in 1957, another Sufan in 1960, another four cleanups in 1963-64, and then ultimately the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to 76 that can then be broken down into a number of campaigns within the larger campaign, most of which were incredibly disruptive. Whereas in Taiwan, what you had was what's called white terror under explicitly martial law. It began as a thing in autumn of 1949. It intensifies dramatically over 1950. It goes on and is deeply nasty through 1954. It rapidly drops off, in 1953. It rapidly drops off in 54. And it continues in name until the abrogation of martial law in 1987. But really, it doesn't do all that much when journalists and so forth become a little bit too open-minded and liberal. There's a crackdown here, there's a crackdown there, there's a crackdown in 1979. But people aren't disappeared, thrown into prison, and executed really at all much after 1954. All right, let's talk about scale. Remarkably, I do have a document that gives me exact numbers for Shanghai for 1951. And we know that in a population of about 6 million, plus or minus a little bit, in 1951, that the exact number of 14,391 counter-revolutionaries were sentenced over the course of 1951. 0.24% of the population, and of these, an almost exact 20% were executed. And we know that there were directives from above that, quote, suggested the execution rates of roughly 20% throughout Sunan for those that had been arrested as counter-revolutionaries. In Taiwan, we have very inconsistent and conflicting numbers. I've done my own analysis. If you want me to go through some of the technicalities, I can go through it. But based on open published sources, my own very, very conservative estimate is that in a population of roughly 8 million, that a minimum of 11,672 rebels were sentenced as rebels in the White Terror in the early 1950s. But execution rates varied enormously from what they called 案件 or case to case. Now, unlike the US, where a case is typically one person who's sort of in the dock, in China, a case or an 案件 can be one person, 2, 5, 10, or a very big and complicated case can be 100 or 120. And then in periods of real push for prosecution and mobilization for White Terror as police action, cases would be joined together to become super cases of several hundreds of people, because these would then begin to be linked. And here, the execution rates varied from 0 to 57%. Now, nobody really knows why there was this kind of variance. I suspect that based on, at least based on a sort of a very preliminary analysis that I've been able to do on a relatively small sample size, it seems that the further away you are from the capital when you're accused of a very similar set of things, the lighter the punishment tends to be. So in 1950, there were two contrasting cases. And in Keelung, which was very close to the capital, the execution rates were like 22%. But for people being accused of almost exactly the same thing down in Kaohsiung, down at the southern end of the island, the execution rates were 0 for something very comparable at the same sort of peak White Terror time. When you got to a set of accusations in the Central Ministry of Ministry of Society, but social work and surveillance for routine kinds of surveillance, like a household registration and so forth, it was 57% execution rate within that particular anjian. Okay. Now, next thing that they had in common was that in both cases, far, far more many people were accused and convicted and executed than there were political enemies. So, in the case of the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, a distinction is made between those, it's a very bureaucratic set of rules, whereby if you were in the outgoing Kuomintang, above, in this list of organizations, above the rank of blah blah, then you were by definition a counter-revolutionary. That was about half of those who were accused and convicted. But the other half was a much looser set of characters who were social enemies. They were called local bullies. They were called the leaders of counter-revolutionary sects. In many cases, they were the kinds of lumpen hanging out on, lumpen toughs hanging out on the local street corner, causing trouble, engaging in petty trafficking or petty smuggling or petty disorder. So this category also included people who under most normal circumstances would simply be seen as street toughs, hanging out on the local street corner. But they were social desirables and social competitors in street life and to some extent, and in small market towns. So only half were, by the stretch of any imagination, political counter-revolutionaries. This comparison is far more stark in the case of Taiwan, because we know that far, far many more people in the White Terror in this period were sentenced than there were members of the Chinese Communist Party in Taiwan. The figures vary. Most of the official figures that I've seen suggest that the actual card-carrying members of the Chinese Communist Party in Taiwan in 1949-50 were somewhere between 700 and 900. From one person who was in a position to know, who I managed to interview, he suggested, some years ago, he suggested that the number of communists was around 2,000, but that actually probably included sympathizers as well as card-carrying members. So at least five times more people than there were at best. Members of the Chinese Communist Party were arrested, accused, arrested, sentenced to some kind of prison or executed. Others were pretty much everyone. Soldiers, suspected of having a different kind of factional loyalty, fellow travelers, independence-minded or simply free-thinking Taiwanese, those unlucky enough to be accused by their neighbors, people who'd been studying abroad at a kind of sensitive and suspect time, and so forth, and so on. Okay. I consider the Kuomintang to have been an equal opportunity repressor. They didn't distinguish. They went after everybody. So, the instrumentality of terror campaigns in both of these places in the early 1950s were very similar in intent. And the intent was to extend the reach of the state and to lower social resistance to state intrusion. This was a way to get rid of political and economic competitors as well as social undesirables. In both cases, this bleeded into a standard law and order campaign. In the case of the People's Republic in Sunan, this was a means to inject the Chinese Communist Party into large state-owned factories. There had been a number of important state-owned factories under the Kuomintang that had simply in Shanghai that had just been taken over by the communists, but they didn't have that much of a presence there in the first year. So I've got documents that show that the campaign is used very explicitly as a way for the Chinese Communist Party in Shanghai to send down special detachments of work teams to establish security committees to enforce the compliance of private actors and to begin to teach factory cadres how you do things like mobilize the people in accusation sessions and so on. In the case of Taiwan, it's done a little bit differently and it's justified a little bit differently with martial law extraordinary regulations, but the upshot is the same. It's a means to extend ROC security organizations in surveillance, to set up networks of informers, to organize special detachments of paramilitary characters to literally go up into the mountains, which were weekly held and weekly supervised by the Kuomintang, on the pretext of hunting communists, because those communists who actually did manage to escape actually did flee into the Aboriginal highlands. So it's extending state reach downward down to the grassroots of society and then geographically up into the highlands of the central spine of the mountain. And in both cases, we've got the presumption of guilt. If you're accused, you're guilty until proven innocent. And in both cases, something very similar happens. Local cadres and the state, in both cases, hold out the promise of lenience if you just fess up. If you confess your guilt and implicate everyone you know, then we will go lightly on you, because by definition, if you're accused, you have to prove that you're innocent. So very, very similar presumptions of guilt, and in both cases, you get bait and switch. All right, so those are the similarities, and they're serious similarities. But in a bunch of other ways, we see this being played out and enacted in very, very different ways. And it starts with official propaganda. So I apologize for the graininess of this image here. This was what happens when you blow up already very poor quality newsprint. But on the left we have a propaganda poster where the worker soldier is shining a light on the evil counter-revolutionary, and actually it's quite humorous. And the caption reads, "Tou Wu," or special agent, special security agent under the outgoing Kuomintang. Where are you? Ni wang nali pa? Where are you running to? Where do you think you're gonna hide? And so you've got the light shining, you've got the guy running kind of hunched over. He's wearing semi-Western clothes, so that immediately makes him suspect, and glasses, and sunglasses, so you can't see his face. He has an old-fashioned radio transmitter that is hooked around his leg, and it says US on the bottom. He's lost his shoe. Here's his cipher, and here's his dagger with the blood of the people dripping. And so this is really quite humorous as well, and engaging as well as being propaganda for the People's Republic of China in Sunan. And this is circulated very widely. I found this both in Chinese posters, a Chinese poster repository, but I also saw the original, or a copy of the original in the archives. This on the right is very typical of the way the nationalists in Taiwan publicized its regulations and of martial law and its capture of key baddies. And this is the announcement of the capture of the leadership of the Taiwan division of the Chinese Communist Party. So you've got this itsy announcement in a big newspaper that's like this by this, and all it does is it states very, very tersely the name of the people who have been captured, that they've been captured, and their age, and that they're now in formal custody, and that's it. And then, like the next day, you get something that's a little bit bigger with a very, very grainy reproduction photograph of the chief leaders of the Communist Party in Taiwan. Minimal information, and when information is given, it's given in black and white. There are no cool visuals, there are no cartoons, there's nothing fun, there's nothing to engage the public particularly. This is about law, order, posting the rules, rectitude. So, it's pretty clear that in both cases, we have anti-subversive campaigns in both Sunan and in Taiwan. But the way in which these campaigns are performed is really very, very different. In fact, they couldn't be more different. And it seems to me that both of these campaigns are performed in a way so that they will be seen to be different from each other. So in the People's Republic of China in Sunan, you have a campaign that is openly and joyously proclaimed as being a mass mobilizational campaign based on class struggle, joyously affirming the campaign and viscerally casting out the baddies. In Taiwan, you have the justification of, it's never called a campaign, but by my criteria, it is. And it's justified in terms of a dubious kind of legality, the legality being martial law. Here are our rules. Procedure, denial of scale. We don't know how big it is. We didn't know how big it was until really very recently. Occasionally, apologies had to be made or justified to the United States, but there was very little about what was going on with these strikes, quote unquote, against enemies within that was being shared really with anybody. Rapid, sharp strikes in public for the PRC, rapid strikes in secret in Taiwan. You got the midnight with security agents showing up at the door and dragging you away with your wife and kids going, "Dad, what the hell is, why, what's going on?" And nobody knew. was very, very typical for Taiwan. In the People's Republic of China and Sunan, you have dramatic, emotional, open, public displays, which I'll get to in a moment. In Taiwan, this is all about procedure, order, rectitude. Here are the rules. Now, in fact, the martial law rules and regulations and special regulations and amendments to the special regulations, there was very little that was, basically they were making it up as they went along. These regulations were so loosely written that you could drive large trucks through them. And in fact, many of these regulations came in only ex post facto after they'd already done really awful things to individuals. But this is how it's justified as a campaign. So if we looked at performing terror, the participatory public campaign versus the concealed legal, and I say legal quote unquote, procedure, okay, we've got the PRC in red, and we've got the Kuomintang in blue. Blue was the color of the Kuomintang. So in Sunan, the form of the performance was the Kongsu Hui, or the public accusation session. Sometimes it's also called the Douzhong Hui, or the mass struggle session. In the Kuomintang in Taiwan, it's called the martial law sentencing hearing. The animating how of the performance in China, in Sunan, is the Gao Chao, literally the high tide of mass emotion where the public and the masses are stirred up to collective action against the evil counter-revolutionary, both merging with each other and with the already reached upon conclusion of the state that these are baddies that have to be gotten rid of. In Taiwan, the performance is all about the reiteration of a reified notion of law. Law in this case means state decisions made by putatively impersonally applied rules. In terms of the players and the stage, again, huge contrast. In Sunan, what you have are pre-coached victims engaging in face-to-face, 面对面 accusations in public space, typically but not always outside public space. In the Kuomintang, this is in Taiwan, it is concealed. The accused, the judge, and the military guards are all in the inside and confined space of the prison. And in terms of the audience, this is where it gets a little tricky analytically. The audience in Sunan and in the PRC more generally it's all about the masses engaging in a public display and public affirmation of revolutionary goals as a collective, so that the individual merges with the crowd, and the crowd in turn merges with what the state wants. So there's the subsummation of the individual through mass acted out narrative of the baddies getting their just desserts. In Taiwan, and I've struggled with this one, but after thinking about it for quite a while, it seems to me that the audience in Taiwan is exactly the same as those who put on the show in Taiwan. Namely, I think that the main audience is the state itself. The public and the relatives of the accused only learn about what's going on in these prisons at about 2 or 3 removes. And they learn enough through whispers and rumor and the disappeared to be scared. But the real audience here seems to be the state itself, needing to justify itself in terms of bureaucratic order, procedure, law, rectitude, and so forth. Now, a couple of visuals. I apologize for not having better ones. We know that this particular accusation session was not in Shanghai or in Sunan, because it was part of the propaganda blitz to prepare the Shanghai public for what was to come. So this was from, let me read it, in 1951. This was published on April 11th, and the sharp strikes in Shanghai only came about 2 weeks later. So we know that this was probably taken somewhere in in northern Jiangsu. But nevertheless, I think it's important enough because this is the main propaganda image that was flashed all over Shanghai and all over Sunan. And indeed, there are other shots that are more blurry of the same accusation meeting that I have, taken from different angles from the audience and whatnot. And what you see here is that the accuser is female. You can sort of see that she has long hair. And the accused, I apologize for the blurriness, this guy here is being physically held and restrained by soldiers. And you can't really see it, but there's a rope around his neck. So that when the charges are read out and the judge says, drop to your feet, if he doesn't drop, he'll be choked and then goes down very quickly. The main thing that you can see here is that the focus of the attention is on the accuser here, who has a microphone because the audience is so large. It's outside. They're on a platform raised above the masses, and this is the focal point of the action, and eventually she'll turn to the baddie and start accusing him like this. And what you see from other shots that are not as clear as this one is that this woman is engaged in constant motion. She's swinging her arms, she's indignant, she's projecting her body, and it's outside. The main thing that I hope that you can get even from here is how big the audience is. From the vantage point of the stage, you can't even get a shot of the entirety of the audience. Compared to Taiwan, there were very, very few photographs of sentencing hearings. There were a few that I was able to see in the archives probably about 12 years ago, but they've now classified things so that you can't get that. You can't even see that stuff anymore. And even 12 or 13 years ago, when I could see some of it, I couldn't have it reproduced because it was too sensitive. But this is one of the very, very few images in the public domain that's circulating. I pulled it off the internet. And this is the public accusation hearing of a very high-level Kuomintang general by the name of Wu Shi. And so this is Wu Shi. He is leaning over a table with a very thick sheaf of documents. He's holding a brush, and he's clearly signing his name or indicating his acknowledgement of this charge, this charge, this charge, and this charge. And you see that this guy is leaning over and making sure that he's signing each and every one to acknowledge his guilt. The woman here was his courier. I think there were about 2 other people who were accused here. What do you notice by way of contrast? Well, the first thing is that it's the judge that's up on the stage rather than the accused that are up on the stage. And that there is no audience to speak of, that this is an inside space. This is a black curtain that is surrounding, suggesting that it's probably a makeshift division of a larger space within the prison, and that there is no public present at all. In fact, the number of military police more or double or triple the number of the defendants. So as a visual, you can hardly imagine a larger contrast. So why, you gotta wonder, why bother? They knew who the baddies were. They'd caught them, they'd arrested them, they'd assembled all kinds of documentation. Why go through these kinds of performances? And I think that the insistence on these performances is that the how needed to be publicly performed to demonstrate regime norms and regime ethos, to lay down public claims to regime legitimacy, to educate the population even at 1 or 2 removes, as in the case of Taiwan, into regime expectations and norms. But you had contrasting goals as far as society was concerned. And in Sunan, the goal was to forge new social bonds of solidarity with each other and the regime via popular mobilization and the publicly affirmed support for getting rid of the old baddies, versus in Taiwan, the goal, as near as I've been able to demonstrate, to guess, was to break apart old social bonds through atomization. You scared people, you isolated them, you atomized them. You kept it quiet, but you shamed them. All right, so the results, quickly, of these different performances. PRC and Sunan dispatched to find enemies of the state, and then some, and you totally cowed their friends and family. The result in ROC Taiwan, identical. In Sunan, you remove the baddies and the impure through a public display. In Taiwan, you remove the baddies through sequestration, through physical removal and hiding them. In Sunan, you had a public and dramatic breakpoint of no return in the revolution, versus in Taiwan, you demonstrated legality, however dubious the legality was. In Sunan, you instructed publics into new state-determined categories through popular participation, as well as popular complicity in the state's violence against its putative enemies. In Taiwan, you warned publics to comply with state law by informing on each other and atomizing individual families from each other and from the rest of society. You also established templates for future action. So in China, what you see going on in Sunan is the replication and the imposition of what had been a moderately successful repertoire for attracting state support and getting rid of baddies in North China in the revolution. And so you have popular mobilization, the public merging behind state-chosen targets and scapegoats. But the problem with this was that it never transferred particularly well to other regions of the country, and the deep attachment to this repertoire, once you got rid of the obvious baddies in the early 1950s, and once you locked people up into work units and nationalized everything, the continued attachment to this repertoire could only be turned inward on oneself. So you have later campaigns with vaguer targets, with techniques now applied to within the confines of the workspace rather than out in open public space, and the burden of proof in terms of accusation going lower and lower and lower and lower over the course of the 1950s. In Taiwan, you had exactly the opposite lessons learned. In the early 1950s, there was a very strong repudiation of the kinds of compromises and factionalism and co-optation that had been felt to be such a failure in China itself. You were an outsider regime who the locals hated, and you had to do something really fast. And so there was a huge concentration of political will in Taiwan to launch highly effective, but also relatively delimited campaigns. So in Taiwan, once you got rid of the usual suspects and then some, and scared the pants off of everybody, you could take a step back, and you didn't insist on continually trying to root out more and more and more impure people. These more minimal legitimating performances of legality and process ultimately required much less from the population in terms of demonstrations of loyalty. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a few final ideas. Now, if we get back to this original idea of bureaucracy and campaign, even when they're not explicitly recognized as such, bureaucratic and campaign modalities are features of a wide variety of state systems. It's not only in China and Taiwan that you see these kinds of things going on. But I suspect that the nexus between bureaucratic and campaign modalities is a variable one. And it's a pretty complicated one, too, because campaigns need the infrastructure and coherence and obedience that only bureaucracy can provide. And under conditions of early state building, they may very well lead to state expansion. But if taken to their logical conclusion, because they are by definition extraordinary, campaigns will necessarily undercut bureaucracy. And we see this most recently in places like Turkey's campaign to rid the country and the judiciary and the and the universities of so-called Gülenists. Nobody knows what a Gülenist is in civil service and the judiciary. And if we think a little bit further about performance, we have the young PRC celebrating a particular constellation of participatory campaigns and public purpose with a very clear script. But we also see that performance features prominently in almost all political systems, both authoritarian and democratic. And so who the protagonists are, what the constraining institutions are, what the expectations of performance are, is very much embedded in ways in which performance either undercuts, supports, or is somehow constrained by the state as well as the signals that it sends. So in Taiwan, the performances were sequestered behind literally walls, and counter-performances ruthlessly quashed. Whereas in the US and the UK, very recently as last October, we had the Supreme Jurist in the UK, a lady by the name of Lady Hall, publicly performing legality and reasoning when Boris Johnson tried to do away with Parliament and so-called prorogue it. And she said, no, 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 you can't do that. And not only did she do it, she did it in a highly public way where she read out in a cut glass accent an absolutely devastating indictment of what the government had tried to pull. Whereas in our own country, very recently, we have Fiona Hill standing up and performing evidence-based reasoning in the closed hearing of Congress. So it's not only that the dramatic and the emotional and the campaign have a kind of performative voice, other sorts of performances might as well. And I will leave it there. Thank you. And they both wear black. You notice how they were both wearing black?
As are you.
It's a standard uniform.
Okay. Is this on? Okay. Thank you very much for a presentation that both addressed the particular cases and also, as was hoped, provided some ways of thinking about the general problems of state building and the challenges of state building. So we are trying to record this for eventual posting, not immediate, but eventual. And so I would like to hand people the microphone so they can have their questions recorded. So anybody? Thoughts? Possibilities? Issues? Yeah.
Well, thank you for this very informative talk. And I was struck by the similarities between the PRC and Taiwan in terms of performing terror to consolidate power.
Yeah.
But once they both regimes consolidated power, they took very different approaches.
Very different, yes.
Yeah, Taiwan tried to learn their lesson, but the PRC continued very similar approach, probably in varying degrees.
Yes.
Can you elaborate more on the factors that contributing to these two different approaches? Yeah, you talk about some. Yeah.
I think I alluded to it a little bit in one of the slides, but probably didn't develop the ideas as much as I might have for reasons of time. When one reads the standard histories, sympathetic histories of the Chinese Revolution that we have for North China, like Fanshan or 10 Mile Village, we have, it's very clear, and it was understood at the time, that the Chinese Communist Party had a set of techniques for making revolution. That, you know, they tried this and they tried that and they tried the other thing, and then eventually they came up with a winning combination under conditions of Japanese invasion in North China with popular mobilization against bad guys, chiefly landlords. Yeah, they were called landlords because this was rural revolution, so it would be landlords that would be the bad guys. And I have a very, and this is more from the other case study in my book that I don't talk about so much today on land reform. But in practice, the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries and land reform in Sunan were concurrent and ongoing, and they overlapped with each other to such an extent that in market towns and in villages outside of the big cities in Sunan, the campaigns were running more or less concurrently, and you even see the categories of one overlapping into the other. So under land reform in villages and in small market towns, you get a lot of people being prosecuted under grounds of being a counter-revolutionary or a, quote, traitor, a hanjian. Okay, so you've got a real overlap in techniques between land reform and the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries. So my sense is that what the communists do, remember, they come into Sunan as an external army of occupation. They had no natural base of support in Sunan and in most of Central and South China in 1949. They came in as an army of occupation very, very quickly, much more quickly than they ever expected would be the case, because in a couple of key battles, the nationalists went blah, 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 they kind of collapsed. So what do? They take what they think has worked under the very different circumstances of North China. And they go like this, ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. And they simply insist that these techniques be replicated under the completely different circumstances of the wealthy cities and the wealthy agricultural regions of Sunan. And I can demonstrate this even more clearly and more effectively with land reform, but in fact, the kinds of categories and the kinds of techniques with public accusation sessions. The public accusation session meeting was identical in both campaigns. And people ask, well, what were the exact numbers in the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries and in land reform? And my answer to that is we will never know, because when the statistics were originally collected in smaller places and in the peri-urban areas of Shanghai, the local cadres themselves didn't make these distinctions. So let's consider them together for the moment. And what is extremely clear is that in the case of land reform, local cadres kept saying, but, people here we have different social and economic conditions here, and people don't hate their landlords. I mean, they really don't. There's not a lot of class hatred here, and so it really doesn't work. And everyone owns land. Everyone is trading in petty, everyone's a petty, every shopkeeper is trading in petty land and is a landlord of some sort. So these categories that you're giving us and insisting that we apply, they make no sense. They really, really make no sense. And so local cadres cannot whip up a lot of class hatred because, in fact, there's so much mobility out of agriculture that the people who are left engaged in agriculture are women, the very young and the very old. Very few able-bodied young men. I mean, they'll go back seasonally, but they're not living in the villages so much anymore. They've migrated in search of a better life. They're working in factories in Shanghai because it's better wages, it's a better life, there's more mobility, and so forth and so on. So what happens is that the regime accepts the split dragging up to a certain point, and then in November 1950, they get all the cadres in the region together in a special enlarged land-reform conference in Shanghai in November of 1950. And local cadres are told, no more excuses. You're going to implement land reform, you're going to do it in this way, with these categories, and we're not going to hear any more excuses from you. And so they go, okay. And they go off and they try to implement this campaign, knowing full well the categories make no sense in the business of class hatred, but they have to whip it up anyways. So what I see is going on is the imposition of a set of techniques that are so closely identical, even in 1949-50, with the success of the revolution that they can't give up on it. And when we come to later periods, 52, 53, 55, 57, there is an ongoing reluctance, even though these techniques make really less and less sense for the moment anyway, right? But it's so closely associated with those legitimacy truth. Are you sure? Sidestepping for a while, but then they always come back to it. So this is a long answer, but
You don't think you can have it back on?
without giving up the hard code of what it means to have a revolution and be a revolution in the first place.
Hi, so I want to ask, you talked about how this is how both states try to legitimize themselves. Like, do you think currently they both succeeded or they're still in progress?
Well, legitimacy is always an ongoing thing, isn't it?
But do you think what they've done achieve what they set for themselves as goals?
Well, it is very clear that in the 1950s, given the goals of regime consolidation, agricultural progress, industrialization, land reform, feeding cities, quelling disturbances, and so forth, and social order, yes, they both succeeded far beyond what you would have imagined was probably going to be possible in 1949.
Right.
Yes.
Then do you think this influence carried over to current days?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, to some degree, in that the Chinese Communist Party still draws legitimacy from having gotten rid of the landlords and the Kuomintang and the bad guys under the bad old days, and reasserted, China's standing up and pride in the world and all of this kind of stuff. And even now, in a more muted form, until 1949 to 57, is still looked upon as a kind of golden age in the historiography. But in fact, now, the Chinese Communist Party legitimizes itself in some very different ways, having to do with globalization and taking our rightful place in the world under late capitalism, and a different model that's going to be better. Talking about this tomorrow. In the case of Taiwan, absolutely not, because you have the rise of civil society in the 60s and 70s, you have liberalization, you have democratization, and a big part of what motored the initial impetus for democratization and opening in lockstep with democratization and opening came demands to open the files on individual family members and to get some kind of restitution for what had happened to tens of thousands of people who'd been unjustly accused and so forth and so on. So very, very different narrative and a very different set of social things going on in the case of Taiwan.
I just want to clarify something before I hand over the microphone, is that my sense is that one of the points of the Sunan comparison is precisely that in each case, the new government, the Kuomintang in Taiwan and the Communist Party in Sunan, are essentially an occupying army. There's a legitimacy in North China that comes from the previous experience, but in both of these cases, they've come and they don't really have a social basis in the same way. Mel?
Yeah, I think that from my research, you're going to need to modify your argument if you're talking about all of China. If you're only talking about North China and the Shanghai area, it makes sense. But the Communist Party was much more flexible in China than you're suggesting. For example, in Tibet, where they took over in 1951, they did not do any of these things.
Right.
So that they had then, it wasn't simply that they had to impose a model. They could very easily not, and they didn't impose it for 8 years.
In the southwest of China, which isn't that far from Tibet, the campaign against counter-revolutionaries was infinitely more vicious, much, much higher death rates, much more viciousness, Yang Kui-sung documents a lot of this for South Central and also Southwest China. And part of the reason for this had to do with being thinly spread and more reactive, and also regime insecurity, quote unquote, the fight against banditry, quote unquote. So there was one region of China that was still somewhat militarily insecure in the southwest and far southwest, and so therefore you see the merging of the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries with, quote, bandit suppression campaigns. In south central China, there are much, much higher death rates and execution rates. So you would have to look at, so you are going to get probably more viciousness in terms of this campaign in almost all the regions that you can think of other than Sunan. But Sunan was pretty independently important because no government could possibly survive and consolidate, even minimally, the rest of the country without the wealth of the greater Shanghai area and the wealth of Sunan. Something like 90% of the wealth of Sunan for years and years and years, and the factories goes to support the rest of the country and to support this is an ongoing operation. So you had to take over Sunan, you had to get it to comply, and you had to get those resource flows going up north to the capital so that they could then be redistributed around the country. So absolutely the case.
In the Southwest also, they did not do it in the Southwest either. In Sichuan and in Shanghai, in Minzu area, in minority areas.
In minority areas,
But
yes.
that's a large part of that whole country there in the Southwest.
Yes, it
So
is.
again, they were able to make a distinction that I think is not evinced in your discussion.
That Minzu policy was very different and much more flexible and accommodating. In the Han Chinese areas of the Southwest, not so much. Much, much worse than in Shanghai.
I'd like to pose a somewhat related question, but one of the things that struck me listening to this was that what it meant to do state building might have been seen differently by the Kuomintang and by the CCP, in the sense that the Kuomintang probably saw a state as a bureaucratic and legal thing, whereas Mao probably saw the state as a matter of campaigns and of a mobilized people. And so to what extent is the difference in approach really also related to a sort of a difference in goal? What they're trying is, it's not just a means, it's also an end.
Right. Well, it's very clear that Mao in particular cared about having the people connect directly and take charge of their revolution and connect directly with the state, with the Chinese Communist Party, with the party state, if you will. But in fact, most of the people around Mao understood the need for bureaucracy and coherence and a planned economy. You can't have a planned economy without a fairly extensive bureaucracy. So there's a difference in goals. So there's a contradiction in goals within the party state in the People's Republic of China from Jump Street. And on the one hand, we've got mass mobilization and campaigns and so forth in this period. But we also have the early 1950s being the period of high Stalinism, where all of these bureaucratic organizations are being set up in the first place. Why? In preparation for a planned economy. So,
in some sense, I think what you're saying is that there is a fundamental contradiction between Mao Zedong thought and the need for a bureaucratic party to develop a state.
well, there probably is a medium to long-term fundamental contradiction.
That's where I get it.
Short to medium term, campaign and bureaucratic modalities were actually mutually reinforcing. because they enabled the state to mobilize people in support and to lower social resistance to the imposition of the party state.
What then implications do you take from that for today? In my reading of the Communist Party, they are...
Campaigns of different kinds.
Well, yeah, given that, but it strikes me that the Communist Party worries on almost a daily basis about its legitimacy,
Yes.
whereas in Taiwan, that's not the case.
No, it's not the case, but if the Kuomintang had stayed in power and hadn't gradually ceded to democratization, which civil society demands, and democratization, they might very well be. So I'm not sure it's a question of campaign versus bureaucracy, but rather monocratic party state where you try to deny and subsume other interests as the possible eventual legitimacy problem.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I have a question as a historian that just goes back a little bit into the 1940s and thinking specifically, especially about Taiwan as a former Japanese colony. And, you know, the Kuomintang comes into Taiwan not too long after, right? And of course, the 1950s is just 5 years. And so my question is the extent to which the Kuomintang is sort of conscious of that history of Japanese empire, and also sort of thinking about the ways in which Taiwan, maybe the Taiwanese population, has kind of been habituated to living under an imperial regime that has also done things in certain ways. And, you know, is the Kuomintang trying to distance itself from that, or is it trying to sort of take on the mantle of sort of the powerful authoritarian regime?
Well, the Kuomintang came in late 1949, late 1945.
Yeah.
Because Taiwan was simply transferred over to the recognized government of China at the end of the war, or shortly after the end of the war, and that was the Republic of China. And so for a couple of years they tried, in a kind of badly done and haphazard way, to repudiate Japanese colonialism and to engage in a policy of so-called decolonization, which local Taiwanese probably thought as recolonization. Now the problem with this was that they were doing so as they were imploding themselves on the mainland. And so what you had was, for the first time really ever, things like hyperinflation that made Weimar Germany look like a day at the beach, to being transported from the mainland to Taiwan with rampant economic mismanagement and a failing civil war and corruption and authoritarian but ineffective authoritarian rule. So there is an awareness and an attempt to decolonize, but in the late 1940s they're utterly incapable. They're so incapable of doing it that they prompt a major uprising that they then quash by the purest of force. So this is a Taiwanese population that is not only nervous and watchful, but they hate the Kuomintang's guts, because the Kuomintang have just engaged only 2 to 3 years before in a massive, massive repression, which wipes out the entire intelligentsia. It wipes out all of the professionals. It wipes out everyone with the university education who isn't a doctor. The doctors are spared, becoming doctors, and so on. So what you have is an attempt actually to repudiate Japanese colonialism very ineffectively, and then when the entire government needs to relocate to Taiwan, this is the point at which you get stiffening of resolve and the real imposition of we got to do better. We got to turn this place into a model. We've got to do, we got to turn this, Taiwan into the dream of what we aspire to do, so that we can be a positive model for the rest of China. This said, it is definitely the case that the Taiwanese population was used to authoritarian government. they were used to authoritarian governments that were much more efficient and much less corrupt. But they were used to a kind of obedience and exclusion from political power. And so, I'll give you a small example. In April of 1949, there was a set of student demonstrations. There were only two universities in Taiwan at the time, National Taiwan University and Taiwan Normal University, and they were virtually contiguous. They still are in Taipei. And again, the kinds of mismanagement in the late 40s and inflation and so forth, and reactive authoritarianism without really the ability to quell, was on its way in Taiwan. But the ability to quell in Taiwan was much stronger to it. In 47, 48, and early 1949, students in all major cities that had universities in China demonstrated against the mismanagement of government, hyperinflation, the cutting of student rations, poor salaries for professors, and so forth and so on. And they were invariably accused of being communist. And they tried to arrest people, but then they always had to let them go on either grounds of procedure or in the face of other mass protests and parents and whatnot. In Taiwan, very, very similar kinds of prompts for a student demonstration when the caloric entitlement and rights statement was suddenly cut. It grew into a demonstration and a march to, at that point, it wasn't the presidential house, it was just the governor's palace. And they shut it down in an afternoon. Now, why did they shut it down in that? Why were they so capable in Taiwan of shutting it down and so incapable of shutting it down in China itself? And I think that there is no definitive answer to this, but I suspect that there were two factors at play. The first is that unlike China, even in the late 1940s, Taiwan lacked the dense networks of student associations and universities around the island or throughout the territory to link up and communicate with each other. There was, in effect, one group that came together, and if you smacked it down, you got everything. But part of it might also have been the lack of support from the local population. Why? Because they'd seen this movie before, only 2 years ago, and it had turned very, very ugly very, very quickly. And so there might have been some curiosity and onlookers, but there was no opportunity for mass support. Why, and why wouldn't there have been? Well, because the Kuomintang had already demonstrated that it was willing to smack people down and to massacre 20 to 40,000 people. And part of this might also have been this legacy of Japanese colonialism. The Japanese colonialism had done a pretty good job of smacking down leftist students as well.
If other people don't have questions, I want to ask one last one, fairly large one. And then I want to say that we can, there are refreshments left. There's cookies, there's brownies, there's lemon bars, there's coffee, there's hot chocolate. And so I was thinking we just sit around, talking after this. But so when I had to write a blurb about this talk, I made a claim in the blurb. And my claim in the blurb was that one of the parts of state building include both giving the public a sense of what they should expect from the state and giving the state's agents a sense of how they should expect to behave, how they should think about what their state is, okay? And I was wondering if you would comment on the ways in which the events of the early 50s in Taiwan and in the PRC did that. Because part of the story on campaigns is that cadres get senses of how they're supposed to behave and so on, right? So can you say a little about the expectations on both the public side and I guess in the case of the PRC, the cadre side, in the case of Taiwan, the bureaucrat side, developed in the context of these early 50s experiences.
So, in the case of the People's Republic of China, at least in Sunan, it's very clear that a lot of what these campaigns are about is a preliminary set of instructions to cadres in how you manage the public to engage with and support the party in particular kinds of ways. And this is the first step in the public learning about what is expected of it in terms of support for the party, in terms of shouting slogans, in terms of taking charge and participating in the revolution, and so on. So cadres are very explicitly instructed, for example, that when you get to the Gaocha, or the high tide, you must have yan face-to-face accusation that's full of sound and color. 有色, 有声, that stir things up, that stir up the audience, and that formulaic accusations will not do. And, very important, the accused must publicly recognize, acknowledge his guilt, 称罪. And if you don't have all of these elements, you've not put on a good show. It's not a successful accusation session. And so the poor cadre is running around saying, okay, I've got to pick, but at the same time, you cannot allow things to go too far out of hand. Too far out of hand does not mean the crowd rushing the stage and summarily killing the baddie. Things going out of control in the communist context means unsupported accusations coming forth spontaneously from the crowd. So the only people who will put up are people whose guilt is already firmly established, with including paper trails and weeks of actual work that goes into it, and coaching of the accusers and so forth and so on. So what's dangerous isn't violence against the baddie who's already been singled out. What's dangerous is unsupported accusations that the state has not already been able to thoroughly vet and put on itself. So there's a very fine line there between keeping control of the proceedings and making sure that all bureaucratic preparation is hidden off stage. It's hidden, it's concealed, but it's definitely there. And having all of the elements that are specified in manuals that I found that says that a successful accusation must have this and this and this and this and this. So that's the PRC side. The other part of this is that the local cadre, again, you can't really see it that well, has to look like he, because it's almost always a he, has to look like he isn't too far from the people. So he wears plain clothing in a monochrome. It's either a PLA uniform or it's a Sun Yat-sen suit, which then becomes called a Mao suit. Whereas in Taiwan, the equivalent guy is wearing a white shirt and sort of Western-style trousers. And never looks like he's of the people. He looks like what he is. He's a white-collar worker in an office somewhere. So the expectations in Taiwan are that that the bureaucrat is going to implement the rules, boom, boom, and there's a rule for everything, and there's a law for everything, and there's a regulation for everything, and the public is going to learn what the posted rules are and comply. So more minimal expectations, I would argue, in the case of Taiwan, which in the short run, which, sort of 35 years ago when I started graduate school, the Kuomintang in Taiwan was vilified as sort of not having a proper set of goals and ethos and so forth and so on. And 35 years later, it's held up as this great shining example. It's small, but held up as this great shining example of authoritarian development that worked. Did everything that we expect and want development to do. Eventually, within a generation, it leads to the rise of a middle class. The middle class eventually clamors for more of a say. The old regime quietly and piece by piece retreats, and it gives way and it accommodates.
All of the things that lots of people thought would happen if we gave most favored nation status to the People's Republic.
Exactly.
Right, economic development will lead to democratization.
Exactly. So much more, so in my view, exactly the features in Taiwan that were so excoriated as not being, oh, this is a serious place. There is no real goal or set of principles. What is Sun Yat-sen thought anyway? Well, it turns out that the flexibility and the lack of content of Sun Yat-sen thought in the long run might be an advantage. So there may be a way to see that if we have something we call Xi Jinping thought, the looser it is, the problem is that Xi Jinping thought is becoming less loose. It's becoming more, it's becoming harder and more controlled and more prescriptive. But Deng Xiaoping thought it was pretty loose. And Deng Xiaoping thought could accommodate a lot of different things. And if it had persisted, it might have eventually been a kind of advantage in a way that Sun Yat-sen thought in Taiwan reflected a certain set of choices and advantages.
Well, I organize a Friday discussion series, the Friday lunch, and those of you who are here who have come to those know that most of the time it ends with some depressing thought, such as that nanoparticles are going to kill us or whatever. So it is a great pleasure to end this one on a note of hope, even if maybe misbegotten and more in the past. But sometimes things turn out sort of okay. And I would like to thank Professor Strauss, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today. And there's lots to think about, right, coming through the snow. And again, to invite you to join for just informal conversation now. Thank you very, very much.